tell us why you became interested in the floodplain issue.
Well, I originally became interested in the floodplain was when I moved here in 1988, right after my son was born, and the cousin of the person we had bought our property from had lost his his wife and 3 daughters during Camille, and I became really good friends with him, Tinker Bryant. And so I would go have coffee, and originally I moved down and I was still pregnant with my son, and you know, we would have coffee, Tinker and I, and he would tell me all the Camille stories. And then there was one morning he said to me, just out of the blue, he said, you know, I'm an old man, Vicki, but you know, I would like you to make a promise. And I'm like, well, you know, tell me what it is and I'll see. And he said, well, if there's anything in the future that comes up that can prevent me, the suffering that I've had to endure for other families, promise me you'll do it. So then, you know, the ACP came and I could hear Tinker and also voice in my head with that promise. And also, I don't know if you remember this, you might have been on the supervisor at that time. They wanted to put that gravel crushing facility, right? So I was like, you know, I had lived down there and I'm like, how can that possibly be that they could with the floodplains? So I called Charlie, I can't remember his last name right now, at the Virginia DCR. And he still was later, he was still there after. But I called him and I said, you know, Charlie, how is this possible that he could do that? You know, they could do that. And he said, well, you know, tell me exactly where it is and I'll look. So he looked at the map and he's like, oh, no, they can't build there. Not only is it in a floodplain, but it's in a floodway. But your supervisor should know that. But anyways, it all came. So that was my first, you know, knowledge about floodplains and stuff. So when I heard this, I'm like, you know, if he said it for that, now this through our floodplains. So I decided I would go down and talk to Tim Padalino, who was the head of our zoning at the time. And it's interesting because it ended up, he had moved here from Pennsylvania to get away from pipelines. And he had done his dissertation or something at UVA on the economics of, you know, natural gas pipelines. And he's like, yes, so for sure, I'm with you on this. But he said, and actually our floodplain ordinance is up for review because FEMA comes in and reviews floodplain ordinances periodically to make sure they meet the minimum requirements. And so he said, so, you know, it's really a good time. Now we were accused of doing this in opposition to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, but it was already in the works. They were reviewing it. So he said, I can propose changes and stuff, but he said, unless the board and the county's behind us, it's never gonna go anywhere. And knowing the board, we're not gonna be able to do a lot, but we could probably insert some really good things because my whole purpose was to protect people in Nelson County like Tinker had asked me in future flood events, right? So I thought, okay, this is my opportunity. So Tim and I brought in Connie Brennan to be, and then Connie, so it was basically myself, Tim, and Connie Brennan. And also there was another person at DCR whose name was Charlie, and I could get you their names, but he had worked on some green projects with Tim Padalino, and so they worked together to come up with changing our floodplain ordinance, and then Connie started pushing it through. And there, you know, everybody was just, you know, everybody told me it was never going to happen. And really through the whole thing to the very end, I think no one, but I kept pushing it because I just knew intuitively that there was something there that we weren't seeing, but with time it would come out. And that's what eventually happened, because it took about 3 or 4 years to get this through the board. And so it went, the board sent it to the planning commission. The planning commission, I don't know, it was like for 5 or 6 months, they had like 5 different meetings. They brought in attorneys because they were worried about that it would be looked at as an anti-ACP move. But they eventually unanimously voted to send it back to the board and with them to approve it. They felt that it should be approved. So then, you know, it was to the board, and, you know, it was interesting that night, and that's the spiritual side I could go into later, but Tommy Harvey was the one that eventually was the swing vote to make it happen. But after he voted, right after he voted, it was like something like, there was like some scrambling, and then he's like, what did I just do? And the girl said, well, you just voted for it. And he goes, well, I don't know that that's what I wanted to, you know, you kind of wanted it. And then, but she said, well, the vote's already been voted, so it got approved that night. And then, of course, the higher standards were not allowing critical facilities to be in floodplains and also, or hazardous materials. So for some reason, they just captured the critical facilities, and no one really wanted to push that it was also hazardous materials. It somehow, they didn't want to admit that natural gas is a hazardous material or something. So they never wanted to talk about that aspect of the ordinance. It was just that we shouldn't have these critical facilities in there. But those were the 2 big ones. But then there were a few minor ones. And actually, FEMA has about 13 higher standards. And I would have, of course, with our kind of floodplains here, I would have voted for all of them. But, you know, Tim said, and so did Connie, that the board didn't want to put too much, you know, like financial impact onto owners. So like these were 2 easy ones because nobody in Nelson County was going to really want to build a critical facility. So they didn't feel the normal Nelsonian would be impacted by this. So that's why we chose the ones that have little impact, because otherwise it never would have gotten approved too. So that's a strategy I would recommend in the future. And I also would encourage, based on this, that counties right now start looking at their floodplain ordinances and start adopting some of these higher standards just for global warming alone. And it's interesting that there's so few people that have like flood insurance, even in Nelson County. It's like amazing how few have it. And one of the things when you do adopt higher standards, and I hope that Nelson County is going to pursue this further, is that you can be part of this community rating system, and it actually decreases premiums because counties have made their floodplains more safer. So I would encourage that, and if they're going to do it, make sure they, you know, pick the standards that they really feel their supervisors. But I think for future this isn't going to go away, and just in general, it's a good idea. So anyway, so back to the story. So then they approved it, and then of course Dominion came in, and you know, now they were required to have a flood, you know, variance for it. And so our Board of Zoning Appeals was the one that had to make that decision. And Tim Padalino really wanted to change the wording in our floodplain ordinance to make it the Board of Supervisors, because they felt that the BZA really didn't have the knowledge to make that kind of decision. So, but that never happened. So it went to the BZA, and they denied the variances to them. And I think that we might have been the only county of the whole 600 miles that actually challenged them, because they had to get floodplain ordinances, or they should have. But Dominion at the very beginning was saying because they were going under floodplains, they didn't need a floodplain variance. So I had a dialogue with the Virginia DCR for quite a while trying to verify that, is that true? And they just weren't answering. So one day I just went over there and I had a meeting with like 10 of them, and Charlie, the two Charlies were there, and it was quite an interesting meeting. And then it was maybe a couple days later, they actually sent a letter to Steve Carter. It's from FEMA saying that that's not true, that they are required, even if they go under. But I think most counties, they just didn't have enough strong enough floodplain ordinance, or they just told them that because that's what we were told, Steve Carter, that they didn't need variances, so that got pushed, and I think only in our county, I think we're the only ones that denied, that they even asked permission, I think Buckingham, because of the compressor station, and they had concerns too. So then, of course, Nelson County got sued by Dominion, or whatever you want to call it. And it did go to court, and eventually the judge ruled in their favor. But the thing that came out of that, and where I think, and this is probably where Ernie thinks, and it was my intuition all along, I said that there was something unseen that was important. And it was actually the Southern Environmental Lawyer.
Southern Environmental Law Center.
Yeah, Center. Who's the main?
Greg Buck.
Greg, yeah, okay. So Greg, the last court case, Greg was in there with, I guess, some helper, and later so they went back after this, and the judge ruled in Dominion's favor, and they started looking at the Clean Water Act and stuff, and sure enough, they found in there that Dominion was required to have floodplain ordinances, intact. So it wasn't, they were saying it was because of these higher standards and all, floodplain ordinances are voluntary. You don't have to have a floodplain ordinance, like no county has to. When you have to have it is when you want to provide federal insurance, floodplain insurance. If you want to have that and be under the auspices of FEMA to come in and help, you have to have that, right? So they were saying because it was voluntary, that's what the judge said. It really didn't have the teeth. But then what Greg found out, it has a lot of teeth because the Clean Water Act. So they were saying the Gas Act, the Natural Gas Act, gave them the right to do this. But the Clean Water Act is above the, so that's where it was. And actually Greg, I think, sent that to the judge who was looking at this, but he still ruled in favor. But when it got like appealed, it was really, that's when it was really going to come out. And I personally feel that they realized that and knew that.
If we wanted to be specific about what we mean by higher standards, does it relate to no critical facilities?
That's one of the higher standards. There's about 13 of them. They prohibit critical facilities. They prohibit hazardous materials. I mean, there's a whole slew of them, but those were the two. We adopted 4 others, 4 together. I think one was how high you had to build up from above the floodplain, they raised that just a little bit. But the two critical ones here, but I would highly recommend with global warming that everybody adopt the higher standards.